Welcome all. My name is Marina Wells. I am Assistant Curator of History and Culture here at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And here at the museum, we ignite learning through explorations of art, history, science, and culture rooted in the stories of people, the region here, and an international seaport. And I congratulate you if you are in the Zoom room with us tonight at session 2 of our Moby-Dick Book Club, because you are likely in the depths of the foggy squall of the boiling maelstrom of this book, sort of squinting at the horizon at what might become of the Pequod. But no spoilers for tonight. Our suggested reading schedule only brings us to about chapter 95, and we do plan to complete the novel for the final book club session on Tuesday, November 18th. That is next time. And at that point, spoiler alerts will be null. But for tonight, to help us disentangle the text this evening, we're joined by two incredible Melville scholars who will lead a discussion of race, nation, and representation, and wherever else your curiosities may lead us. So in the Zoom room tonight, we have Wynne Kelly of MIT and Bob Wallace of Northern Kentucky University, and each has written about 100, 200 books each on Melville, I'm pretty sure. That's about right. So thank you both so much for spending tonight with us and sharing all of your wisdom. And thank you all, the participants. Thank you so much for your enthusiasm. It looks like we have 163 people in the Zoom room so far tonight, and we welcome you to use that chat function. Feel free to say hello. You can tell us where you're from as last time. Perhaps, you know, tell us whether this is your first time reading the novel or not. And you can just use that function throughout the evening and have exchanges with your fellow participants. Also, separately, please, we invite you to use the Q&A function to submit questions about the text to engage with the scholars here. And so please be ready if you do submit questions in the Q&A to ask those live. So we will unmute you and then you can ask those with video, with audio, if you're comfortable doing so. And like last time, feel free to use the reading guide on the website as inspiration for some of the themes, some of the ideas, the questions that we're covering here tonight. But first, before we hear from you all, we will hear some words of introduction from the Melville scholars. This is such a short time for us to meet together to cover such an expanse of pages, of gams, of whale body parts. And we really hope that these scholars will help us dive deeper into the tome's depths. So with that, let's dive in. And I think we will hear first from Wynne. Thanks again, everybody, for being here.
Oh, thank you, Marina. And good afternoon and welcome to all of you. Our topic is race, nation, and representation. I like to start at the back, so I'm going to say a few words about representation and incidentally about human and animal, but mostly animal intelligence. So the best statement I've read about representation in Moby Dick comes from Toni Morrison's essay, Unspeakable Things Unspoken, The Afro-American Presence in American Literature, 1988, followed by her book, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination. Taken together, these works suggest that the representation of people of color in white-authored American texts is always there and never mentioned. A perverse form of representation, to say the least. With the presence of many non-white characters, as Bob Wallace is going to talk about, Melville complicates that assumption that white characters are the ones who matter. But Toni Morrison goes on to suggest that whiteness gets represented in the novel as a vicious racial ideology that maims Ahab and deserves to be hunted down and killed. It's a radical argument. The book's haunting premise, she says, is that the figure of whiteness, Moby Dick, is not, as Starbuck says, a dumb brute, but a fiendishly cunning adversary. Melville demonstrates furthermore that humans are not alone in displaying intelligence, both in individuals and in social groups. Like 19th century social reformers who argued against racist science and its classification of human intelligence according to racial identity, Melville represents intelligence as crossing boundaries. Here, the boundaries of species. So we've already seen indications of animal intelligence in the novel when, for example, Ishmael reveals Ahab's conviction that the whale acted toward him with malice. Quote, I see in him outrageous strength with an inscrutable malice sinewing it. It's a wonderful sentence. Ahab could be anthropomorphizing here, but his precise definition of whale motivation goes beyond monstrous physical strength to stress subtle intelligence. So our work today with chapters 48 to 95 doesn't seem to offer many opportunities to talk about whale intelligence, focusing, as they do, on the whale hunt and the dissection of whale bodies and rendering of their blubber into oil, which is the manufacture of a commercial product. Nevertheless, Chapter 87, The Grand Armada, demonstrates convincingly that whales have social intelligence, not just individual intelligence, but social intelligence. When the hunters attack the whale nursery where the babies feed, the whales, while seeming to flee the hunters, succeed, nevertheless, in encircling the hunters and making them pause in their slaughter. It is almost, Ishmael speculates, as if the cows and calves had been purposely locked up in this innermost fold. That's a quote. The whales thus protecting their most vulnerable members. The hunters do considerable damage, but then, quote, the entire host of whales came tumbling upon their inner center as if to pile themselves up in one common mountain, unquote, creating a narrow exit through which the whale boats barely make their escape in total panic. The whales here are not behaving monstrously, but strategically. So, we know that well into the 20th century, scientists misunderstood intelligent mammals until Jane Goodall, well, I said memory, observed them in the wild instead of in laboratories. More recently, as marine biologist Joe Roman has reported, ocean scientists have observed whale social behavior like headbutting and targeting ships, as well as uses of sounds that resemble language. Melville didn't know those things, but he repeatedly emphasizes the value of observing whales up close, not in engravings of dead flesh, thus anticipating contemporary science in representing advanced animal intelligence in his novel, and thereby unsettling our ideas of human exceptionalism. He also suggests a way to think about and represent intelligence outside of human whiteness, which I consider a pretty remarkable feat. Thanks a lot, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Wynne. I'm going to start with a passage from the end of chapter 70, The Sphinx. O nature, and O soul of man, how far beyond all utterance are your linked analogies. Not the smallest atom stirs in nature, but has its cunning duplicate in mind. Now that we are in the middle of the novel, we begin to see linked analogies everywhere. Ishmael has just created one such analogy in chapter 68, the blanket. There he compares the blubber of the whale to a blanket that keeps people warm when the air is cold and they are in bed. Way back in chapter 11, Ishmael and Queequeg are together in bed. They have nothing but the blanket between them and the cold of the outer air. Ishmael compares them to one warm spark in the heart of an Arctic crystal. Returning to chapter 68, the blanket of the whale keeps him warm, even in the heart of Arctic waters. Ishmael invites his reader to admire and model thyself after the whale. Do thou too remain warm among ice. So here in the middle of the novel, we also begin to see a series of linked analogies between sequence of ships. The first 5 gams in the novel occur in our reading for today. In 2 of these, the Pequod meets with ships from other nations, allowing Ishmael to explore elements of national identity in obvious and almost human ways. In chapter 81, the Pequod meets the Virgin. This German ship is so incompetent that it has to beg the Pequod for enough whale oil to heat its coffee. In chapter 91, the Pequod meets the Rosebud. This French whale ship is so incompetent that the only whale it has caught is the dead one that was left abandoned by another ship. That whale smells so badly that the surgeon on the Rosebud prefers to breathe the air in the ship's shithouse. So in chapter 100, the Pequod will meet the Samuel Enderby, the English whale ship whose captain is a cunning duplicate of Captain Ahab. But that's in the final group of chapters, so we have to wait for the next time to discuss that. The first actual gam in the novel is the Town Ho story, chapter 54. The Town Ho is an American whale ship that reveals enduring elements of American identity. The conflict between Steelkilt and Radney is between a Great Lakes sailor and a Nantucket mate that ends in an aborted mutiny. You may have noticed that this is a very long chapter, much longer than cetology even. So while the Pequod is, having gams with foreign and American ships, we also have another analogy playing out of a different kind between the living whale and the human heart and mind. When Moby-Dick himself arrives at the end of the Town Ho story, Moby-Dick disposes of Rodney before Steelkilt can do so, and Ishmael compares this act to a judgment of God. In chapter 81, after meeting with the Virgin, the Pequod harpoons an old bull whale with a broken fin, blinded eyes, and an ulcerous wound upon his side. Ishmael looks down over the side of the boat and sees and feels the pain and anguish of this old wounded whale. He compares its plight to that of the sailors in the Persian fleet that was demolished by the Greeks in the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. Ishmael's imaginative engagement with the inner life of that old wounded bull whale prepares him for the transformative gam with the massive pod of living whales in the Grand Armada. As his shipmates are trying to wound and kill as many whales as they can on the surface of the sea, Ishmael looks deep down beneath the carnage to see a newborn whale looking up at Ishmael's boat as if it were a bit of gulfweed in its newborn sight. So from this point on in the novel, the linked analogies between whales and humans in Ishmael's imagination continue to grow alongside the killing of whales in the ocean and the gams with other ships. So back to Marina.
Thank you so much both for getting us started. And I'll say, I am not seeing too many questions in the Q&A. So participants, please put your thoughts in there in the Q&A function. You can submit your questions to ask the scholars. Do you think there's so many interesting themes that you're pulling out of this really challenging middle section of the book? And one of the questions that you post in the reading guide, I think is really interesting. And I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts on the question of, how does Melville, how does he represent whales in the text? How does he represent different human cultures? And the vital question of, are these humane or inhumane representations? And I'm curious to hear what's behind that question, what you're sort of interested in getting at in that question of humane versus inhumane. Either of you.
I think we were both talking about it in a way,
Yep.
and thinking about that question, right? And I was thinking about it from the perspective of intelligence, that human intelligence is considered superior to animal intelligence. And yet it shows itself as failing at a moment like the one in the Grand Armada where the hunters can't see because they're overwhelmed by the chaos that the whales create, which turns out to be a deliberate maneuver. So it contrasts the inhumanity of the Melville contrasts the inhumanity of the hunters with the inhumanity of the whales in a sense because they don't behave the way humans expect them to. It's full of complications.
Yeah, and the whole way in which Ishmael turns around in his imagination in the really it's very dramatic in the Grand Armada chapter and starts seeing whales as living sentient creatures who have responses like us and who we need to respect. That goes into the larger question of analogies and cunning similarities between whales and humans. And that extends into human races also. So the whole idea of living creatures respecting each other rather than killing them or ignoring them or whatever, it's all of a piece, I think, all of those, all of those senses go against the purpose of killing whales that they're all involved in at the start of the novel.
We have a question coming in from Patty Hamrick, who, if Patty would like to ask this, um, related to bringing race into this question of sort of different types of representation. Patty, you can go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was thinking, the topic included race. I think both of your guys bringing up of like the whales as a kind of representation is really interesting. But before we started talking, I was thinking more about race. And in particular, I wondered what you think about Pip going mad and how that relates to or doesn't relate to his function as pretty much the only, or at least the only speaking African American character.
Unless you count Dagu.
But
Yeah.
he's African African rather than
Yeah,
African
well, true. Good point.
Well, Pip goes through a transformation in his own life and in the reader's life in the course of the novel. And he starts showing his individuality in the first lowering when he talks about the white squall in a way that shows that he's deeply observing and feeling what's going on aboard the ship. But it's not until he goes overboard, and before he does, Melville has that passage about black having its beauty too. And Melville, one feels, has been waiting to find a way and a place to show Pip's full humanity. And maybe it's not full, but when he is isolated in the ocean, and I guess in a way he receives an identity beyond the way he's been treated in the novel. He's just a living creature there, and he comes back in a different way. And in literary terms, I like to think of him as becoming very similar to the fool in King Lear. He sees things very clearly and feels things more clearly than a lot of people do. So he becomes a major factor in the book as things that were ignored early in the book come to have a full reality that can be very moving.
It's related to the
Thank you.
representation question, Patty, because you brought up the fact that Pip would be read today as representing a particular group. And yet, for Melville, the Lear reference and so on shows that he's not clear, perhaps, or as defined as we would hope about that. And so he places him in the doubloon chapter as oh, we haven't gotten to that yet, right? As speaking in terms of madness, and he seems to take away from his humanity at the same time that he gives him an important role to play. So that's why I think that the representation of the book doesn't follow the rules of what we would be hoping for, a kind of a way of representing humanity that removes bias and exclusion and exclusivity. And Melville makes us see that it's not possible to see people fully, even as much as he does represent them.
But also in the doubloon chapter, Pip conjugates the word to see. I look, you look, they look, and that really sums up the process of the book in an important way. He sees the subjectivity and kind of universality of people trying to make sense of what they're doing. And that comes very nicely as a comment on what all his shipmates have been saying about the doubloon.
Yeah.
Kate Nabehu has a related question, I think, about the problematics of racist representation in the book. Kate, you can go ahead.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Melville goes really all in on the noble savage and his representation in his depiction of non-white characters, emphasis on both parts, except for the hidden whalers, who are all Asian. What's up with they're just savage? What's up with that? Would there have been something about um, who was participating in the whaling fleets that Melville would have interacted with? Was there something with regard to stereotypes and politics of the day, or can we not trace it to anything specific, just, necessities of drama?
So much in that question.
In one way, that hidden crew is the creation of Ahab, and there's some question whether they actually exist or they're some romantic invention. But I think that the Lascars and the people they represent are still manning our ships today, our big cargo ships. It's a culture that had been used by Western people to make their ships move. So in that way, he's probably mirroring some actual social dynamics that were going on. But of course, Fedallah is there as a special character as their leader.
And I think that he does play on the idea that these people are unfamiliar, especially since Fedallah is an amalgam of so many different countries and identities, and he escapes definitions. So this is the part that's, as you say, it's an unsatisfying representation of Asianness, but that may not have been what Melville was aiming for. Although, as Bob says, that there was considerable reality, and he had a considerable experience of multinational sailors. So as with many of these things, it's really hard to pin him down. These are great questions.
Are great questions. We like to stick close to the text, but there's an interesting question. I'm keeping a vague eye on the chat, although there's lots of chatter, but so we're prioritizing the Q&A. But so a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A should you like to ask them live. There's a question about the sort of popular response to the representation of race in the novel. And someone asked, yeah, what did Frederick Douglass think of, of this book? And I wonder, just as an aside, perhaps relatedly, maybe Bob Wallace would want to speak to that.
Yeah, well, Douglass followed Melville. He actually quoted from Taipei in his North Star newspaper. He quoted the passage on tattooing at some length. And then I was really interested to find that in 1856, in Frederick Douglass's paper, they quote from Moby-Dick, and it's when Stubb is exhorting the crew. That long passage Stubb has is connected with the presidential election in 1856. So Douglass was monitoring Melville for sure. And that was actually from James McCune Smith, who was a Black doctor, the first Black doctor in New York, who wrote that column under the name Communipaw. So they were aware of each other, but I don't have any example of their actually meeting. I'd be surprised if they didn't, because Douglass was coming to New York in 48, 50, 48, 49, and 50 when Melville was living there, and he was very visible. So I think I would guess that he admired Melville for addressing race issues, but he would have liked Melville to come out in a positive way for abolition, which, Melville didn't do. So Melville was sensitive to race, but he wasn't an activist in the way Douglass was. So I think he'd be curious about him, but wanting more. And I guess there's one other footnote to that. The first publication Douglass wrote was in 1842 in Boston. He'd just gone to work with Garrison, and the George Latimer case came up, where George Latimer escaped from slavery in Virginia and was then apprehended in Boston, and his owners sent somebody up to claim him. The case went to Judge Shaw, Melville's future father-in-law, and Shaw decided against Latimer. And Douglass, while the case was still being heard, wrote a incredible denunciation of Shaw for considering sending this young man and family back into slavery. So Shaw was attacked as a Judas, actually, in the newspaper. There's a whole newspaper was published for a month about this case, and Douglass was very strong in attacking Shaw. So it's interesting that that became Melville's father-in-law in 47, and Melville depended on Shaw financially through that whole period. So that may have cramped Melville's style a little bit about how he wrote about the very heavy fugitive slave topic.
Thank you for that, Bob. Bob is an expert on Douglass and Melville, so thank you for speaking to that. But back to the text and thinking about the representations of Black characters, Claire has a question.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I have read the book 4 times over audiobook, and I'm going through my very first time reading it in the text, and I still cannot wrap my head around Stubb's supper, especially the sermon that Fleece gives to the sharks. I absolutely adore it, but I cannot make literal heads or tails of it. So will you please help me? Are we supposed to just take away from it that Stubb is being cruel and making fun of Fleece? What are we meant to take away from this?
Well, this is particularly close to my heart because I had to read this chapter in the marathon during the Zoom period. And if you think it's hard to read on the page, reading it out loud, the whole thing, Tim Marr and I did it as a dialogue. And I learned so much about the language. I should preface this by saying that the representation of, speaking of representation of Fleece here, is very much drawn from minstrel theater, and that Melville apparently enjoyed minstrel theater. He went to theaters in New York that were representing Black people being played by white actors in blackface, and it's one of the things I have trouble getting my head around. However, as I think you've really made a great point about Stubb's cruelty and the fact that Fleece calls him a shark, and is in his sermon to the sharks is telling them they must govern their natures, while Stubb is standing there right next to him chomping on whale meat and not governing his. Fleece has the moral authority in the chapter, the upper hand. And also, I would point out that even though the language is debased and offensive, it's very rich. It draws from scripture. It's much more honest than Stubb's language. Stubb is always gaily laughing and chuckling over things that get worse and worse, and seeming to be the sort of clown. Fleece is the one who understands what the sharks are doing. They are making bloody chaos in the water. So I think the contrast between them, which looks like one in which Stubb has all the authority, gets reversed and undone by the end of the chapter.
I totally agree. Based on a long time of teaching, this is a really complicated chapter for first-time readers. And I remember in grad school when I was first reading it, what is this racist chapter doing in the middle of the book? I didn't get the whole texture of it, but it does expose Stubb's racism in a very powerful way. And every time I read it, I feel Fleece's pretty deep agency in responding to him. He answers those questions really well. And he is, I think, expressing more effective individuality in the way he handles that situation than Stubb is himself. So it's too bad with Fleece we never see him again. It's only in this chapter. But after, wondering about that many years while teaching, of course, students respond in very different ways to that chapter. And most of them, first-time readers, tend to just be disappointed by the apparent racism of it. When we had a Moby-Dick marathon in about 2008, we'd been discussing this in class at some length, and one of my former students got this chapter to read in the marathon. And by then she had internalized Stubb's, she had internalized actually Fleece's agency in this conversation. And she had us laughing through the whole chapter. So if you've got Stubb, if you're inside Fleece and see how he's responding to this, it's quite a powerful chapter that turns Stubb on his head, really. So that's how I tend to read it now after seeing students respond in that way. And I think in generations, students are seeing that, but it's still just hard to get past the surface of that blatant cruelty and heaviness that Stubb is trying to enforce. But I think Fleece operates very well under the circumstances.
There's a question about which chapter it is, and it's chapter 64, Stubb's Supper.
Relatedly, Rachel has a question about whiteness. And yeah, whiteness. Go for it, Rachel.
Cool. So in our last one of these meetings, we talked a lot about how the text is very subversive and how it critiques dominant power hierarchies around like religion, society, and culture, and even the hierarchies that you've mentioned today between like human and animal intelligences. And thinking about this discussion around the critique of whiteness, what would you say was the effect of how Melville critiques whiteness in the way that he does? Often dominant narratives equate whiteness with purity and innocence and extend these notions of white supremacy, whereas Melville, as a white novelist, and Ishmael or Ahab equates the white whale with this concept of evil, and these characters, they're functioning as mouthpieces for the critique of whiteness. What do you think is the effect of that?
The effect. I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I'm rereading Marty, and he's so much more. Bob was talking about Melville not expressing his anti-slavery sentiments, but he's so much more open and passionate about it there. And even in his early books, Typee and Omu, he's criticizing whiteness from the very beginning, especially white missionaries and white colonialism. So if we're missing it in this book somehow, I have to put the question back to all of you, which is, why do we have these doubts about his position? What is he doing through the character of Ishmael to complicate or face the question of his real understanding of racial difference, which he experienced as a sailor? So I'm not answering the question. I'm going to leave it to Bob.
I think Ishmael goes through many shades of approach to this question. I think one thing that's kind of typical of Melville maybe is in chapter 2 in where Ishmael wanders into the black church by accident, and 100 black eyes turn around and peer at him. It's an interesting moment of reciprocity. And Ishmael runs out because he's frightened by it. And he's responding like Redburn and a lot of Melville white characters do to discomfort in the presence of Black people. And I think Melville is honest about that. And that allows the kind of transformation that Ishmael goes through with Queequeg, not a Black character, but certainly a non-white character. And I think that kind of transition is really important. Rather than having his white characters who become woke, be woke all the time, he shows them waking up. And I think that's one moment early in the book. And then there are many other kind of such moments. I guess for me, the whiteness of the whale chapter is in a way the heart of it. The sentence where Ishmael has that long paragraph. It's about a 15, 20, 30 word paragraph that he, although whiteness is honorable and beautiful and worshipped by all these cultures, yet there is something deep in that hue which is, more frightening than blood. Whiteness is a very dangerous thing. It's a very slippery thing, and it can be used in very negative ways and perceived in negative ways. So I think that both in terms of the plot level, he shows white appearing characters able to respond to non-white characters in important ways. The way he sees Pip as things unfold, the way he contrasts Dagu and Flask all the way through, there are humorous moments of it. So I think we do see him evolving toward a much more embrace of all humanity, and then of the whales too, as living creatures. I think that for me, that is the ultimate drive that comes out of the book, but there are complicated moments as an American and somebody out there on the ocean dealing with people of a lot of cultures. So I think it's another case where it's transformative, but it's never consistent. It has to be relearned and under new circumstances all the time.
We have a question coming from Benjamin.
Hello, howdy from Texas, if you can hear me. So yeah, I want to turn to the whales and the question of the animal that's been coming up sort of on the margins here or there. And I'm particularly interested in Ishmael's relationship to whales as the narrator of the text. So this is a question that's always struck me. I remember reading Stubb kills a whale kind of breathlessly and gasping with the exclamation, his heart had burst, and this really emotional outburst there. But I'm thinking about this question from the reading guide. How do you feel when Stubb kills the whale? And I think a deeper level of that question is, how does Ishmael make us feel when we read this passage, right? He's the medium through which we encounter this death of the whale. And there's something of a sort of contradiction going on in the sort of text, his description of it, right? He describes the red tide pouring from the sides of the monster, but then he describes more and more the tormented body and the agony of the whale, right? This kind of recognition of the subjectivity of the whale going on. And so my question revolves around Ishmael's kind of double identity here as someone who obviously has this connection to whales in an emotional level, also thinks about whales quite a bit. He's quite obsessed with them, but also goes out as a laborer onto the sea to kill them in this sort of era of what you might call the emergence of kind of global capitalism as a laborer and as someone whose labor kind of alienates him from this more philosophical, compassionate sort of connection to animals and all life. So just this kind of dual identity of Ishmael and how this kind of feeds into the narrative, especially in its depiction of whales and dying whales. That's sort of my interest.
I feel that passage is a great example of Melville's message. He doesn't write editorials against whaling. He describes what happens, in this case in highly charged language, that some readers will understand and feel the full force of his concern for what's being done to that living creature. But other readers might read it the way a newspaper is. They say they finally caught a whale. It's the first whale, and Stubbs, so I was surprised to find that one of the authors who wrote a long book sympathetic to whales thought that Ishmael was condoning the killing of this whale because it's just described in kind of journalistic sense without Melville imposing judgment. I think the fact that he allows the reader to read through those words to feel what his words are wanting to convey is another of his strengths as a writer. So that some readers are going to miss it, and just as the first big action scene where they finally get a whale, a few students still do read that. But if you feel the force of exactly what you described, the red tide pouring and everything about the way that action is described, it's a huge turning point from the push to kill whales and the whole point of the whaling industry toward our ecological view of the whale today. It's a turning point in the novel, and I think it's kind of turning point in that the culture caught up with later.
You also asked about Ishmael as narrator, and I just wanted to add just one thought, which is that he could have ended with the red tide. He had made his point, but then Ishmael watches while Stubb churns inside the whale's body as if he were looking for a gold watch. And Ishmael says, but that gold watch he sought was the innermost life of the fish. So that image of the gold watch is something valuable and prized, and at the same time treated so callously and mechanically here. It becomes an uncanny experience. And we've gotten way beyond the physical violence into something much more disturbing. So it's that extra layer of perception that comes from Ishmael, who's not claiming it. He's not saying, I, Ishmael, at this moment, suggests that Melville needs a narrator who is there as a witness to the full dimensions of these acts.
Exactly. Yeah.
Really troubling.
This is what it's about. He makes us see it and feel it. And that is Stubb. I mean, Stubb is so hard he has some great moments on the humorous plot level in spite of his inhumanity. But he's a real character. He's the kind of person you have to have on your boat if you're going to succeed in this business. Ishmael shows that if you're on a whale boat, you want Stubb to be your head of your boat. And our country still depends on Stubbs, unfortunately, in a lot of ways. And his callousness is just really hard to stomach, whatever way it comes up.
Yeah.
Well, continuing on the topic of killing these intelligent, beautiful creatures, we have a question from Jeanette.
Yeah, so regarding Melville's line of query into the intelligence and the soul and waking up to this what they're doing and questioning it, was he way far out of the box for his time period? Like would people have just thought, what is he saying, or is his writing subtle enough that he kind of would bring them along before they realize it?
I'm trying to think of anyone in the period who addressed whales in the ways that he did, and I don't know of any. But one telling detail, to not to answer your question, but to just to suggest what he saw that maybe other people didn't. I think he's the only writer about animals in the 19th century who used personal pronouns. So the whale, there aren't too many she's, but the whale is he. It's not it. He's not it. And it's that sensitivity that suggests that he was angry at a culture that didn't know whales and was able to come to an opinion about them from such a distance. As for was he out of the box? I think it depends on what box you're in and how you think about it. But we certainly find, as I was trying to suggest, people, scientists responding to Melville today, somewhat the way they do to Thoreau, as an observer of his environment and the natural world, who just took in things that others did not.
And there's one really good example of a scientist doing that, and that's Beale's Natural History of the Sperm Whale, which Melville had a copy of, and he got a copy of it before he finished Moby-Dick. He couldn't find, after he went to England, he couldn't find a copy in New York, so he imported one. He was also aware of the new cetologists who were bringing a more scientific approach to the whale. Beale was on British whale ships, and he observed whales and wrote about their intelligence, their habits. He also wrote about encounters with whales, and one of those was with probably the inspiration for the old bull whale that gets killed. The ship is off of Japan, and there's a big 40-barrel whale who the British ship kills, but who sinks out of sight before his oil can be harvested, a 40-pound bull. This was a young bull whale, not the old one that Melville has. And that is this was in 39. And he shows, this author shows a lot of sympathy for the whale as a living creature that can suffer pain and whatever. And he also shows its strength. And Melville quotes him a few times in the novel, but this same moment in Beale's Natural History inspired Turner, the British painter, in one of his 4 whaling oils that he did 5 years before Melville got to London. And in the painting that's now at the New York Met, the whale ship, where you've got the whale being attacked in the water in the foreground, and the ship is in the back, and with gray, mysterious looking colors up in the masts, and those colors are exactly the shape of the blubber that's cut from the whale during cutting in. So like Turner is, and he's also showing whalers being dumped into the sea. So he quoted that passage from Beale, Turner did, when he showed this painting at the Royal Academy. And that was in the catalog of the academies. When Melville went to London, he also met some really very close friends of Turner. So I think the Brits had started to create a really sensitive attempt to know the whale as a fellow living creature, and that Beale was the great example of that. And when in the cetology chapter, Melville says that in some remote areas, scientists are treating whales a very different way, just measuring them as technical things to analyze. And that's when cetology started. So the transition from the natural history of whales to cetology is a very important one. And so Melville had definitely took the natural history approach as a living creature. And he's also in the Oxford English Dictionary as the first person to use cetology, which is kind of surprising.
Well, on the topic of are whales people too, Karen has a question.
Well, my question was stating was, we see numerous examples of personification of the whales, and in particular Moby Dick. And in fact, now it's been months since I've read The Whiteness of the Whale, but that and other chapters leading up to it, it was a watershed moment when, as I was reading The Whiteness of the Whale, that I thought, whoa, Melville is kind of portraying Moby Dick as God. There's that dichotomy of the symbolism of whiteness. Whiteness is good and pure, but also something to be feared. The way, you know, one's concept of God, let's say, is you know, the wrathful, vengeful God, as well as the generous, loving God. I just think there are lots of allusions to Moby Dick as portraying an entity that is omniscient. And anyway, that's one of the realizations I had about the extent of the personification of the Melville's personification of whales.
That's why I chose the word anthropomorphizing, because
Oh,
it would
yeah.
be more common, I think, in the period to assume that whales were nice. They didn't mean anything harmful to humans. How could they? They wouldn't be intelligent enough. But you've added another dimension to this idea that to be a god is not to be nice either, especially a Puritan god. And Melville grew up in the Dutch Reformed Church, which was a Calvinist denomination. We are going to see more of those, and especially towards the end. And what interests me in a lot of these references, it's come up in my classes, is that they're not all to a Christian god. They're often to pagan, or pagan in the sense of classical Greek, like the Fates, Zeus, or to Egyptian and even Islamic gods, as Tim Marr talked about. So the mapping that certainly complicates the idea of what kind of god Moby Dick might be, and what Melville might be sorting out in his references to gods.
And one of the first examples is in that town ho story, where Moby shows up at the end. And first, when you see him, he's incredibly beautiful. The whiteness of his visible body in the ocean, it's an extraordinary, it's as beautiful as when he first comes in the first day of the chase. But then Radney, who is a pretty bad guy all the way around in my mind, gets on him and tries to kill him, and Moby Dick swallows him, basically. And Ishmael thinks that he might be representing the judgment of God. Here, in terms of the plot of that particular chapter, he is the avenging God who takes care of Radney before Steelkilt has to do it. So that's a powerful representation of Moby Dick himself, who in this case maybe happens to be white. And then you have so many deep positive images of Moby Dick himself. But whiteness itself in chapter 41 remains a very complex concept.
Yeah.
Claire has another question related to the town ho story here.
I am so excited that I get to ask this one. So my project this summer was reading all of Paradise Lost with a friend who's teaching a Milton class this fall. I've looked all through Moby Dick for connections with John Milton and Paradise Lost, and the only place I found it so far is in the town ho story. 1/3 of the crew mutinies on the town ho. In Paradise Lost, 1/3 of the angels become rebels and revolt against God the Sun.
And are cast into darkness.
The beautiful color imagery we get with Moby Dick being living opal is specifically how John Milton refers to the outside and the gates of heaven that you can see as you're looking up toward it. So not really so much of a question, but this is the last place in Moby Dick I thought I would see John Milton was in this gore horror story of the town ho. So I wanted to reflect on that and ask if other people see this connection also.
Well, the one I come back to again and again is in the last chapter before the epilogue, in which something satanic appears. So yeah, it's very much in Melville's brain. There's been a lot of good scholarship on that.
And I just say about the town post story, it is a very long digression when we get to it, seeming digression. It's the one chapter that Melville published before the novel as a short story. And what I like about it is the way Steelkilt plays off against Starbuck at the end. Won't say too much about the end of the book, but if Starbuck was Steelkilt, the novel would have ended in a totally different way. Their names sound alike, and Steelkilt's the kind of person who would have done what needed to be done, especially, I mean, in a humanistic way, but also because Ahab has taken the ship away from its proper source, and it's then the duty of the mate to take over the ship if the captain has done that. And so Starbuck has a kind of official reason to deal with Ahab in some way, but it's very hard to do, and his Christian beliefs get in the way, and it's a very painful moment in the Musket when he's trying to do that and can't. And I mean, what a dilemma. It's very difficult. So I think Steelkilt is an incredibly interesting foil to Starbuck. So that really brings this early chapter right to the end in a very strong way.
There are so many interesting questions and so little time. So I'm wondering if James would like to speak to a question, I believe, related to the reading guide.
I'm not sure which question you wanted me to address. Can I be heard?
Yes, we can
Yes.
hear you. You do want to.
Okay. Well, the technology is amazing. So I'm not sure which one it was that I asked. Was it the one about the free fish, or the
Yes.
was it that one?
Right.
Well, yeah. What's going on there? I mean, I'm trying to read this book, and I'm finding every time I talk to a new person about it, I learned something new that I had a perspective I never thought of. So I'd love to just hear what reaction you were curious about when you had that study question.
Well, we're practically out of time, but I think the Fast Fish and Loose Fish answers a lot of the questions about how Melville addresses slavery, because that's what a fast fish is. And the irony and the subversiveness of that chapter certainly suggests that he was not promoting a corrupt and cruel and vicious system in any way. But the tone is complicating because it's light and witty. And that is what I always find makes it difficult. I mean, there are many other things that make it difficult. So that's the most I think I have time to say.
Yeah, I agree that the comparisons with the serfs in Russia and inferiority pushed throughout the world to other creatures is very strong at the end of that chapter. But I think also when he says to the reader, "What are you but a fast fish and a loose fish too?" It's really something about one of his many passages about free will and fate, and that we're never as free as we think we are. And it kind of ties in with the end of the Map Maker in that sense, so that it's a very interesting chapter legally, but especially in these comments at the end of the chapter.
And it's sly because if you're a fast fish, it's to him and his book that you are tied fast.
Well, that's right.
And can't pull yourself free. So it's a proclamation of his own power. Ishmael as perhaps the teller of the story.
Yeah, I like it.
I hope it's okay if we stay on for just a few more minutes just to wrap up with a couple questions. I would be remiss if I didn't bring up chapter 94, which is my favorite, a squeeze of the hand.
Yes.
And this wonderful question is on the reading guide about how that is directly between Castaway and the cassock, how these are just in close proximity. They're really different. And what is the impact of this? What is Melville doing? And it brings up this larger sort of question for me about sort of the ordering of the novel. And this can be read as a challenging part of the book that a lot of readers don't necessarily get through. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to that sort of juxtaposition of really different genres, moods, tones, that kind of thing.
Well, I wrote the question. So, and it came out of students' a question. They wanted to know, is the book a tragedy? Is it a comedy? Is it, and maybe it's a big poem. And those three chapters in particular suggest all three. I mean, the story of the castaway and Pip's loss of himself is a tragedy. The cassock is a comedy. It's about it's a very comic treatment of a barbarous and bloody moment. The squeeze of the hand is there's more to it than the squeezing. It devolves into a discussion of language, but it's also seems to me very lyrical and philosophical about the male comradeship that is, also being expressed in different ways in the other two chapters. So to me, the interesting thing is, just as you said, Marina, that they are jammed together in this perplexing way. And they again raise the question of where, Melville or Ishmael stands in relation to all these complex. But the point is that Melville is himself such an omnivorous writer, and he's just collecting so many ways to think about his topic that he can't help himself. He's got to do tragedy, comedy, lyric, and yesterday's news all at the same time. It's
the contrast from the isolation that Pip is in the castaway, and then the Whitman-like togetherness and homoerotic implications of the next chapter. They're a wonderful contrast. And then after that, you get the cassock, which is the penis of the whale, and which ties into the sexual element of the book, and it ends on the word archbishopric. And, so he's just, like Shakespeare, I would say he's mixing comedy and tragedy together and doing it with lyricism and juxtaposition. And it's just, you just wonder if he could have planned something that rich, or if it just came together, if it came out that way. But if you think about it, those three chapters are wonderful together.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I think tragically we do have to wrap up. Time, strength, cash, patience. Thank you all. Thank you so much to our scholars. A virtual round of applause. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And please join us at our next book club session on November 18th. Same place, same time, 5:30 on Zoom. This is going to be the week before the week of Thanksgiving, and I hope you'll find kinship along this keel here. So please come visit the New Bedford Whaling Museum anytime. Please become a member. You get free admission when you become a member. You get discounts. You get early notice of programs like Moby-Dick Marathon and many other perks. So please become a member. And of course, you are cordially invited to this year's Moby-Dick Marathon. And that is our annual wonderful reading that takes 25 hours on January 3rd, which it's our Olympics, it's our Super Bowl at the museum. It's a whole weekend of fun festivities and Melville nerddom. So, and that this year is going to take place on the very anniversary of Melville himself sailing out of New Bedford Harbor on his own whaling voyage. So we hope you'll join us in January. But for now, happy reading. Thank you again for joining us, and farewell.